X 2001 crimes. Some of the most puzzling crimes attributed to Isreal Keyes happened at unknown times to unknown victims. All that is known is a possible location and the number of people it happened to. The very first murder, he recounted to investigators, happened while he was in Nia Bay, around the time he had proposed to his long-distance girlfriend. This would have put the crime anywhere from July to October of 2001. When did he kill this person? He wouldn't say. Where did it happen? He wasn't willing to share. Who was it? Why? How? He'd never tell. The sheer lack of detail makes it extremely difficult to narrow down potential victims. Trying to match a murder to a missing persons case could be a losing game if the person was never reported missing in the first place. The fact that nothing has ever been recovered from this crime, no body, no evidence, nothing but Isreal Keyes' own words, makes things even more difficult. For all investigators knew, he could have simply made the whole thing up. He was a bit more specific when he brought up the next crime, though the timeline was even more hazy than the last. At some point between the summer of 2001 and 2005, he murdered a male-female couple of unspecified age, race, and even exact relation to each other. They were simply two people he killed together. They may have been locals, tourists, or even random people Keyes had abducted from elsewhere and brought back to Washington. Additionally, due to factors that will be discussed later, authorities believe this crime may have happened closer to 2005. It is also unknown how exactly these people died. Keyes implied that he may have buried them somewhere near a valley. If they had a car, he may have driven it away from the scene of the crime. There was yet another possible crime in 2001 that is sometimes attributed to Keyes. That November, 16-year-old Kamiluella Volendroff and her boyfriend, 18-year-old Eugene Hyatt, both from Staten, Oregon, were visiting Hyatt's grandparents at their oceanside condo in Depoe Bay during the Thanksgiving break. Hyatt's grandfather recalled that November 21, 2001, morning as a normal one. The two teens got ready and told the grandparents that they were going to the beach to look at the tide pools. This beach was located close by, within Boiler Bay State Park. They left at around 10 in the morning and promised to return soon, as they were going to join Hyatt's grandfather on a shopping trip. When the teens' excursion went on longer than anticipated, the older man thought little of it. A walk on the beach is hardly something anyone would want to rush after all. It was not until later that evening, when Hyatt and Volendroff failed to show up to dinner, that Hyatt's grandparents began to worry. They called the police just before midnight to report the teenagers as missing, though for unknown reasons, there was no response until the following morning. Given the area where the two vanished, which has been described as extremely treacherous within that week, both the grandparents and authorities came to what seemed then as the most sensible and likely conclusion. The two had been swept out to sea. Local law enforcement contacted the fire department, as well as the Coast Guard, to conduct a search, but nothing was found. 2 days later, on Friday, November 23rd, police issued a short press release where they announced fears that Hyatt and Volendroff had been hit by a rogue wave. They reported an incident that occurred on Thursday the 22nd, where this happened to an adult man standing on the rocky shores. Luckily for that man, who had been dressed in bright yellow, he was spotted by another person with a cell phone. This other person immediately called the Coast Guard, though the man in yellow was unharmed and was even able to pull himself out of the water. What were the odds that this exact same scenario could have happened the previous day to two people at once, neither of whom was able to resurface? The only evidence ever found came when searchers located just one of Hyatt's tennis shoes. This is where suspicions of foul play came into this case. When it came to cases of unsolved disappearances with virtually zero clues to go on, it is understandable why a victim's family would cling to hope that their loved one is still alive somewhere. After all, zero proof of anything also means zero proof of death. This is likely why, in September 2004, Kami Volendroff's family found new hope after a strange photo was found in a magazine. The person who discovered the photo had been a friend of Volendroff. The friend and her boyfriend were attending a bachelor party where they flipped through some magazines. In one of the magazines, the friend saw an advertisement for strip clubs and similar services, and attached to the ad was the photo of a brown-haired young woman called Cindy. There was also a phone number linked to the Portland, Oregon area, as well as the accompanying caption, "Naughty OR, nice, very open-minded, and discreet alarmed." The friend immediately took this advertisement to Volendroff's family. The family, who had been unhappy with the way the investigation was going since the beginning, hoped that this would finally be a lead in the case. Ruby Peavy, Volendroff's grandmother, recalled, "Evidently they think that a wave washed them off into the ocean. But the Coast Guard told us it was so rare for 2 people to go in the water and not one body come back out." The family got in contact with organizations such as the Interstate Association for Stolen Children and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Both groups agreed that there was a strong resemblance between Volendroff and this mysterious Cindy. Computer analysis allegedly resulted in there being over a 99% match that the two were one and the same. What else was there to do now but to call the Portland phone number? Police called, asked for Cindy, and were told by a female voice to call back in a few minutes before she abruptly hung up. When they called again, the connection was weak, but they could make out the same woman telling them she would try to get in contact with Cindy for them. She never did. Digging deeper into where exactly in Portland this phone number was linked led police to a man named Gary Mullen. Unfortunately, the only information Mullen was able to provide was that the image of Cindy had been a stock photo taken from the internet. It was how the magazine obtained photos for all the advertisements featured. The case once again hit a dead end and has stayed that way ever since. However, in more recent years, amateur internet sleuths keep returning to one name, Isreal Keyes. The argument for Keyes' involvement is best laid out by Josh Hallmark, the host of True Crime Bullshit, a podcast that may be the most definitive source on Keyes' life and crimes outside of FBI case files. In episode 7 of season 1, Hallmark notes that nobody saw Hyatt or Volendroff arrive at the tide pools. Additionally, Hyatt's grandfather had gotten into the shower before they left, so nobody saw them leave, or which direction they left in, either. Hallmark describes what the walk to the tide pools might have looked like. It's about a 3-minute, 0.2-mile walk from the condo to the park itself. The walk would have taken them briefly down Highway 101, along a field, and then down a park exit road which travels parallel to the highway at a decline. The majority of this road cannot be seen from the highway, nor the main parking area of the state park. At the time of their disappearance, the land across the highway was all forested and considered part of Boiler Bay State Park. There's now a micro-neighborhood on this land, but according to Zillow, it wasn't finished with construction until 2005. So at most, there was an empty construction site. 2 unsuspecting teenagers walking down an obscured road may have been an ideal target for a would-be killer, especially one who had already learned to only target total strangers. But Keyes was supposed to have been in Neah Bay, Washington at the time, not in Oregon, right? Late 2001 was a very busy time in his life. He had left the Army, broken up with a longtime girlfriend, moved in with a new girlfriend who he was expecting a child with, and was fixing up a house badly in need of repair. But in November, Keyes had not yet started his new Parks and Recreation job. The only one employed at the time was Tammy, and her job often required her to travel. Of course, there was nothing preventing her from bringing her boyfriend on these, sometimes days-long trips. That was exactly what happened when she needed to spend a week in Ocean Shores, Washington, just 2 months before Hyatt and Volendroff vanished. Hallmark continues. Ocean Shores is a small coastal town on the Quinault Reservation at the base of the Olympic Mountains on the Washington Peninsula. It's about equidistant between Neah Bay and Depot Bay, and just 40 miles to the east in the Olympic National Park is what could be considered the most pronounced and accessible valley in all of Washington state, where Highway 101 passes Lake Quinault and the remote and isolated Quinault Valley across the state line. And on the way from Depot Bay to Neah Bay, there is a valley that exists almost entirely on federal land. With Tammy working, Is would have found himself with a lot of free time he had to explore an area he already knew quite well. Could he, after having scoped out the land, have made a trip to the park during the Thanksgiving holiday? The argument for Keyes' involvement is best laid out by Josh Hallmark, the host of True Crime Bullshit, a podcast that may be the most definitive source on Keyes' life and crimes outside of FBI case files. In episode 7 of season 1, Hallmark notes that nobody saw Hyatt or Vollendorf arrive at the tide pools. Additionally, Hyatt's grandfather had gotten into the shower before they left, so nobody saw them leave, or which direction they left in, either. Hallmark describes what the walk to the tide pools might have looked like. It's about a 3-minute, 0.2-mile walk from the condo to the park itself. The walk would have taken them briefly down Highway 101, along a field, and then down a park exit road which travels parallel to the highway at a decline. The majority of this road cannot be seen from the highway, nor the main parking area of the state park. At the time of their disappearance, the land across the highway was all forested and considered part of Boiler Bay State Park. There's now a micro-neighborhood on this land, but according to Zillow, it wasn't finished with construction until 2005. So at most, there was an empty construction site. 2 unsuspecting teenagers walking down an obscured road may have been an ideal target for a would-be killer, especially one who had already learned to only target total strangers. But Keyes was supposed to have been in Nia Bay, Washington at the time, not in Oregon, right? Late 2001 was a very busy time in his life. He had left the Army, broken up with a longtime girlfriend, moved in with a new girlfriend who he was expecting a child with, and was fixing up a house badly in need of repair. But in November, Keyes had not yet started his new Parks and Recreation job. The only one employed at the time was Tammy, and her job often required her to travel. Of course, there was nothing preventing her from bringing her boyfriend on these, sometimes days-long trips. That was exactly what happened when she needed to spend a week in Ocean Shores, Washington, just 2 months before Hyatt and Vollendorf vanished. Hallmark continues. Ocean Shores is a small coastal town on the Quinault Reservation at the base of the Olympic Mountains on the Washington Peninsula. It's about equidistant between Nia Bay and Depot Bay, and just 40 miles to the east in the Olympic National Park is what could be considered the most pronounced and accessible valley in all of Washington state, where Highway 101 passes Lake Quinault and the remote and isolated Quinault Valley across the state line. And on the way from Depot Bay to Nia Bay, there is a valley that exists almost entirely on federal land. With Tammy working, Is would have found himself with a lot of free time he had to explore an area he already knew quite well. Could he, after having scoped out the land, have made a trip to the park during the Thanksgiving holiday? 11. Family life. In October 2001, Tammy Hawkins was still working hard at her job as a manager for the Maka tribe's Early Childhood Development Department, while heavily pregnant. Though the role was fulfilling, the hours were long, and the workload was never ending. She was up and about, trying to get everything done on time when she suddenly felt her water break. She called to let her boyfriend Is know what happened. In between the pains of labor, Tammy wondered how Is was going to react to it all. He was still so young and had a stubborn streak. He had been taught growing up to never trust doctors, and it had taken a lot to convince him that she would be better off giving birth in a hospital. He disagreed. He had birthed a lot of lamb as a kid. How much different could a human baby be? Tammy knew that Is had been trying to seem calm and collected during her entire pregnancy, but she was still surprised when he all but fell apart when he learned about her going into labor. In the very early hours of October 31st, he got her to the closest hospital in Port Angeles. Is soon calmed down but refused to leave her side for the rest of the labor. The baby was a girl. Her name was not officially released, and she became known to the public under the pseudonym Sarah. Tammy had already known that Is would take to fatherhood easily, especially given how good he was with her son Keaton, but the bond he developed with Sarah was immediately apparent. "I saw his life change when she was born," Tammy would recall, When they returned home, Is took over most of the domestic duties while Tammy recovered. She could not help but admire how responsible he was. Not only did he take over all the cooking and cleaning without complaint, but he did it well, a testament to how good a father he would be. This dynamic continued mostly unchanged, even as Tammy returned to work. Is got up earlier than she did, fed Sarah, and got the baby to daycare so that Tammy could sleep in a little longer. It was a happy time, but it wouldn't last long. Though Sarah was born healthy, she soon developed asthma. Later, she contracted respiratory syncytial virus, better known as RSV, which can cause serious lung issues in infants in severe cases. RSV is common and is generally easily treated, but Is and Tammy disagreed on how their daughter should be treated. He had no choice but to let Tammy give birth where she thought was best, but he was unwilling to compromise further when it came to medical decisions. For as much as Is wanted to rebel from his upbringing, there were still some aspects of his parents' belief system that had stuck with him after all. A big one was vaccines. Is had grown up without ever having gotten any shots, and he was perfectly healthy, he argued. His mother always told him that tea and a hot bath could treat almost any sickness. Tammy did not agree, but she did not rock the boat when it came to Is. Now that she finally had some sense of stability again, she was unwilling to risk it over arguments they could resolve together. For now, she would have to try and overlook this part of him. She would soon find that there were many things about him that she had to overlook. The relationship grew rockier 6 months after Sarah's birth. Tammy had been experiencing severe pains and went to a doctor who discovered that her uterine lining was full of tumors. She was prescribed pain medication to make life bearable until something more could be done. That turned out to be a hysterectomy, an intense procedure that meant she could never have more children. To cope with the stress of life and the pain caused by her condition, Tammy developed an addiction to her pills. With Tammy ill, Is took up an even greater role at home. He and Sarah become very attached, but the combination of parenting, housework, and his regular job overwhelmed him. Those who knew him during this time knew he liked to drink, but now he was drinking heavily all the time. Both he and Tammy found themselves turning into different people. Is was still hard-working and responsible, but he became colder, more aloof towards his friends and family. Tammy still loved Is, but found more and more of what she believed to be proof of his infidelity. She grew paranoid and insecure, behavior that Is found stifling. She was shocked when she caught Is watching bisexual porn. Not long after, she caught him messaging another girl while playing online video games. Panicked, she attempted to gain access to his computer to message the girl. Is did not take well to the invasion of privacy. The tension would escalate to an incident of possible domestic violence. Is had a green filing cabinet that he kept in the garage. He was reportedly extremely secretive about what was inside. Tammy had never seen what he had kept in there, and now she could not help but suspect he had something hidden from her. Is caught her trying to open it and was furious. A screaming match broke out, and a concerned neighbor contacted the police. When authorities arrived, Tammy managed to convince them that the entire ordeal had been solely her fault. Nothing came of the report, but the relationship was never the same again. The crumbling relationship depressed them both, but they tried to make it work for the sake of both Sarah and Keaton. In November 2002, Is's parents, Heidi and John Jeffrey Keyes, were traveling across the East Coast from Maine to Indiana, where they had plans to move to. Since their semi-Amish religious beliefs forbade them from flying in planes, they only traveled by train. It was during this trip that Is's father suddenly fell severely ill. He had been suffering from chronic medical issues, including a problem with his thyroid, that he had refused proper medical treatment for. His condition soon turned grim. The train staff, unprepared to deal with a situation of this magnitude, told Heidi that she needed to get her husband help right away. The Keyes were removed from the train, though it is unknown if Heidi ever got John Jeffrey to a hospital or not. Is's father passed away on November 13, 2002. He was only 50 years old. Understandably, the loss devastated Is. His relationship with his father had never been great, but they had slowly repaired their bond over the past few years. Tammy believed that Is had truly hoped to fully reconcile with his father someday, and the fact that he would never get to took its toll on his mental health. Is left Nia Bay for some time to go to Maine for the funeral. But did he really go to the funeral? Tammy, as well as Iz's friends at this time, remember that Is seldom spoke about his parents. Is being in an interracial relationship and now having a mixed-race daughter seemed to have soured things between himself and Heidi again, so he all but ceased to bring them up around Tammy. In fact, he would not even talk to Tammy about his father's death. The supposed trip to Maine was all that he shared with her. No obituary or burial records for John Jeffrey Keyes were publicly available, so a funeral would be difficult to corroborate. What we do know is that Is liked to take trips, and he tended to use any reason to take them. And if Is had really been up to no good, who could have stopped him? The next few months saw Tammy's addiction worsen. She spent much of her time either sleeping or zoned out. What little energy or focus she was able to muster was used to care for Sarah. Her vague suspicions about Iz's infidelity never really went away, but she lacked the clarity to notice what he was actually up to on a daily basis. Is was constantly scoping out potential victims. One evening in 2003, 19-year-old Wendy Morris was driving through the Olympic Peninsula down State Route 112 when she realized she was running low on gas. She had made this long, desolate drive many times before, but this was the kind of place you never fully let your guard down at. Her cell phone, if it could have even gotten reception out there, had no battery. She turned the music up on her radio and prayed that her car could keep running until she got to the next gas station, wherever that would be. The car was running on fumes by the time she managed to pull into a station. The place was empty, not a single other soul anywhere in sight, but luckily she could pay with a credit card at the pump itself. As she pumped the gas, an eerie feeling came over her, as though she was being watched. Tense, she took another look around the area, and this time she saw a truck in the distance. It was difficult to tell for certain, but she thought she saw a male figure in the driver's seat. He was looking right at her. Wendy hurriedly put the pump back in its place and climbed into her car. She started the engine and wasted no time getting back on the road. As she drove off, she checked the rearview mirror and saw the truck's headlights come on. The lights grew brighter. The truck came closer. Wendy stepped on the gas and tried to convince herself that it was all just a coincidence. The whole thing just seemed so strange because they were out in the middle of nowhere, right? She tried to calm herself, but she could not make herself believe there was no danger when the truck got so close it nearly rear-ended her. Then the truck passed her and started moving faster. She hoped for a moment that it was finally headed its separate way, but that hope was dashed when the truck came to a sudden stop right in the middle of the road. Wendy narrowly avoided crashing into it. Her fear rendered her motionless for an agonizing moment. She took a deep breath and pulled into the next lane. Before she could get very far, the truck sped up in front of her again. Wendy tried swerving from lane to lane a few more times, but each time the truck driver cut her off. It only ended when the driver finally stepped out of his vehicle. Even with her headlights, Wendy could make out very little detail about what this man looked like. He was tall, she could tell, somewhat lanky but with some muscle. This was someone who looked strong. The driver made a motion with his hands. It took Wendy a moment to register it as him telling her to come closer. The thought of it made her recoil in fear. Thankfully, she knew better than to follow orders from a stranger. She stayed inside her vehicle and kept on driving, and just as she suspected, he soon started behind her again. He must have been angry now. Wendy managed to keep ahead of him until they reached the nearest town, a place with possible witnesses. The driver gave up and turned around, headed back out west. Located to the west of Wendy's destination was Nia Bay. She had gotten lucky. She had no idea that there were others in the area who would not be. 12. The boat. In 2004, Is had lost all hope that he and Tammy were ever getting back to the good times. By this time, Tammy's addiction had gotten so bad that she was, at most times, physically ally present, but mentally gone. They had been fighting constantly and now seemed to share nothing in common aside from their young daughter, who was far closer to Is than she was with her mother. Anyone could see that the dynamic between the parents had grown toxic, and Is was adamant that Sarah was going to grow up in a stable environment. Still, the thought of leaving Tammy hurt. In the summer of 2004, when Is made the difficult decision to break up with her, they had been together for just over 3 years. Is was now 26 years old and still had a bright future ahead. It was a shame that the woman he loved could not have the same. Tammy had actually proposed to him back in December of 2002. They were celebrating 2 years together when she surprised him with an engagement ring. He had readily accepted. They had high hopes for their wedding, for their life together, but neither would come to be. It certainly did not help that Tammy had initially refused to accept the breakup. She begged him to stay, and he nearly gave in. He might have done so if there wasn't a child that needed to be taken care of. The whole thing devastated Is, stressed him out greatly, and whenever he got stressed out, he tended to find some not-so-typical ways to blow off steam. Is still maintained a good relationship with both Tammy's ex-husband and the son they shared. The ex-husband, referred to by the pseudonym Joe, had gotten closer to Is because Is often drove Keaton out to visit his father for his custody time. In fact, back in early 2005, Joe wanted to sell his old boat and thought Is would have been the perfect person to buy it. Is was unsure. The boat was not in great condition. It would require a lot of repair, something he just did not have time for in between work and being a newly single father. He told Joe he would need to think it over and then disappeared over the weekend. When he showed up again, he was suddenly eager to take the boat off Joe's hands. By summer of that same year, the boat was able to go back in the water. Joe and several of Iz's work friends were impressed by how well Is had managed to fix the old thing up. From then on, the boat became a regular hangout spot for Is and his buddies. Sometimes, he even brought Sarah and Keaton along and taught the boy how to fish. While the boat came to symbolize happy memories for Iz's loved ones, it also served a much more nefarious purpose. It became a tool with which Is could carry out his crimes. One such crime was the possible double homicide of a couple. Though the date this murder could have taken place within stretches from 2001 to 2005, the FBI believes that 2005 is the more likely time due to this being the year that the boat was acquired. Since the couple may have been out-of-state tourists, it is possible that Is could have come across them near one of Washington's scenic lakes. Also in 2005, Is was believed to have committed another murder, this one of a woman at or around Lake Crescent in Olympic National Park. Such as with the murder of the couple, there are no substantial details available about this crime, but Is did hint at how he could have disposed of the body: homemade anchors made of plastic milk jugs. He used 3 to 5 of them to weigh his victim down into the seemingly bottomless depths of the lake. Indeed, Lake Crescent is deep, over 600 feet deep, but it is also famous for its clear waters. Less famous is some of the dark history that surrounds it. Tales from Native American tribes describe it as a place born out of rage. Mount Storm King, a mountain to the south, was angered at the presence of 2 warring tribes, so it broke off its tip and hurled it at them. The boulder bisected the large body of water that the Klallam tribe knew as the Slumut Lake, creating Lake Crescent and the smaller Lake Sutherland. Over the years, many people have gone missing in the lake, either accidentally or through dubious means. Most infamous of those disappearances was that of Hallie Latham Illingworth, a young barmaid whose heavily bound corpse was discovered floating on the lake's surface back in the 1940s. Hallie, it was eventually determined, was murdered by her abusive and womanizing third husband, Monty J. Illingworth, after the rope used to bind her was linked back to him. The story gained notoriety due to the strange condition that Hallie's body was found in. A chemical reaction turned Hallie's fatty tissues into a waxy substance. She had essentially been turned into soap. If we are to believe Iz's own words, the unknown woman he murdered here is most likely still at the bottom of Lake Crescent. But in a lake known for its clarity, would it not be possible, if not straightforward, for an aerial search to locate human remains? If not a body, then at least the concrete anchors which are not subject to decomposition? With so little to go on, It may be tempting to disregard Is's claims about these unknown Washington victims in favor of more substantial cases. It is not unheard of for known murderers to lie about or even straight-up invent victims to inflate their kill count and confuse authorities. This may have well been the case for Is if it had not been for a few concerning items that were found on the boat years later: rope, cable ties, traces of blood, and even some small pieces of human bone. 13. The New Woman. Despite Is's assertions to the contrary, Tammy had held out hope that she and him would someday get back together. It was a belief that was, perhaps, not totally without merit. Even though they had broken up in the summer of 2004, she and Is still spent time in each other's company, often sleeping together. This went on even after Is had started dating other women, even committing to longer relationships with them. She felt that there was still a spark between the two that had not yet gone out, and she was determined to rebuild their little family. Life was still not back on track in other ways for her, either. Her drug addiction had only gotten worse, and it made it difficult for her and Is to communicate with each other. For a long time, he would only talk to Tammy if the conversation was about their daughter. Tammy was high when she got into a serious car accident that landed her in legal trouble. If there was one silver lining to it all, it was that spending nearly a month in jail forced her to get clean. After that, she was obligated to go to drug rehab for several weeks. When she got out, she was feeling like her old self again. Is even allowed her to come to his house and see Sarah. They began to see each other more frequently, their chemistry still apparent. But then Is threw a wrench in her plans. In 2006, he informed her that he was dating a new woman he had met online, and the relationship was getting serious. The news shook Tammy to her core. For a while, she continued to live in denial. When Is started going on trips with this woman, sometimes even taking Sarah along with them, Tammy tried to tell herself that things would not last. She and Is were supposed to get married and be happy. She had endured so much and was finally getting better. Wasn't that enough? The damage was done. Is made it clear that they could never go back to the way things were. On Sarah's birthday, Is informed her of his plans to visit his new girlfriend. Heartbroken, Tammy tried to ignore her feelings, but ultimately found herself getting desperate. She discovered that this other woman was named Kimberly, possibly a pseudonym, and she lived in Port Angeles, Washington. Somehow, she found Kimberly's workplace and left an aggressive note on her car telling the woman that she and Is were still very much involved. To Tammy's dismay, Kimberly was unfazed by the note. Instead, the relationship only grew more serious. In early 2007, after Kimberly landed a full-time position in Anchorage, Alaska, she invited Is and Sarah to move there with her. Is accepted and filed a relocation request to be able to move with Sarah. In a final desperate attempt to keep Is around, Tammy opposed the relocation request, leading to the courts denying it. She had hoped that Is would stick around for a custody battle, but unexpectedly, he relented and allowed Tammy to have full custody of their daughter. This is what forced Tammy to finally accept that Is wanted out, and that she could do nothing to stop him. She begrudgingly agreed to split custody. Sarah would spend every other year in Alaska with her father. In March, Is finally left Washington. He spent a few days on the road, driving on the highway that connected Canada to Alaska, and arrived in Anchorage on the 9th. Interestingly, it did not appear that he stayed there for long following his arrival, as he was soon traveling again up and down the west coast of the continental United States as well as Mexico. Much of his time was spent in California, where he presumably did short-term contracting jobs to save up money before officially settling into Kimberly's home. Understanding the dynamic between Is and Kimberly painted a clearer picture of the type of person Is had become. Many details about Kimberly have been kept private, and for good reason. What we do know is that, like Tammy, Kimberly was older than Is by about a decade. She had a stable, high-paying, but hectic career in the medical field that required her to travel often. She got along well with Sarah, but had no children of her own. Kimberly was a mature and incredibly independent woman. traits that Is found attractive for multiple reasons. Chief among those reasons was the fact that Kimberly's frequent work trips left Is with a lot of alone time. She was away from home so often that she and Is only saw each other on weekends, and even then, these free weekends were not a guarantee, as she sometimes found it easier to stay in hotels in anticipation for the next job than to come back to the house on Spur Lane. This gave Is plenty of time to familiarize himself with the unforgiving Alaskan landscape and lean into his double life. Another bonus to Kimberly's work life: frequent flyer miles. Just as he had with Tammy, Is sometimes tagged along on Kimberly's trips before he got his own job. Sometimes these were short vacations that they spent together, but most of the time, Is was off doing whatever he pleased by himself. Better yet, using Kimberly's miles made it harder for anyone to track his movements, just in case he was up to no good. In the meantime, however, he had to try and keep up appearances. He started his own company, Keyes Construction, and soon found plenty of work, both within Anchorage as well as in other states. His website boasted over 10 years' worth of construction experience and offered services ranging from fence building and repairs to kitchen remodels. His work was, as it had always been, top-notch. If customers had any complaints, it likely had to do with how Is had a tendency to vanish for days at a time. 14 East Coast crimes. Though nobody had lived there for years, Keyes still owned some property, his dilapidated cabin near Constable, New York. Claiming that he was going to check on the land provided him with a good reason to travel frequently, though, in reality, he hardly cared about the place. In late October of 2008, Keyes boarded a flight from Anchorage to Seattle, Washington. In Seattle, he rented a 2008 PT Cruiser from October 31st to November 5th, racking up over 600 miles before catching a flight to Boston, Massachusetts. The FBI believes that Keyes partook in some sort of criminal behavior, possibly a murder, before returning to Anchorage, but has not publicly stated why. One possible hint? He perhaps purchased a fishing license, and Keyes had a habit of multitasking. We know that his boat was used for both leisure and disposing of at least one body. If Keyes went fishing, he might have also been dumping something or someone. This will be evidenced by perhaps his most infamous crime a few years later. It was the following year, in 2009, that Keyes's criminal behavior is believed to have ramped up. To start, he would make another trip to the East Coast as he supposedly made plans to visit family in Indiana before heading to the property in New York. On April 1, 2009, he departed from Anchorage and landed in Washington. He spent the next few days traveling between Seattle, Neah Bay, and Saquon before getting on another plane, this time heading towards Manchester, New Hampshire on the 7th. In Manchester, he rented a car and booked a room at the Highlander Inn for April 8th. His actions on this day, as well as the 10th, have been accounted for. It is what he was up to on the 9th that has since become a topic of interest. The trip took a suspicious turn almost immediately. On the same day that Keyes booked a 2-night stay at the Highlander Inn in Manchester, he made another booking for the same dates at the Handy Suites Hotel in Essex, Vermont. Things got even stranger upon learning that Keyes had likely not been in either New Hampshire nor Vermont on the 9th. Instead, he was probably in New Jersey. Given how cagey he would later be about his activities during his interrogation, it was unlikely that he would have ever admitted to any specifics. However, much like with the Emerson case, Keyes did give enough crumbs of information for authorities to work backwards. It was on April 9th, he would confess, that he abducted a woman, took her across state lines, raped her, killed her, and buried her somewhere in New York. A look into missing persons cases filed around that time brings up one name that meets the criteria: Deborah Feldman. The last memory 48-year-old Deborah Feldman has was not a happy one. On April 8, 2009, she was with her son, Matthew, in her Hackensack, New Jersey, home and was desperate for money. She had a long history of drug addiction, as Matthew explained, doing heroin, coke, you name it, and was emotionally unstable. Her vices led her to becoming a prostitute and losing custody of Matthew when he was in his teens. Deborah demanded that Matthew hand over his entire paycheck, a total of $400 he earned from working at a Wendy's, and became furious when he denied it to her. She cried, telling Matthew that she would kill herself if he did not give her money. Matthew was unmoved. This was not the first time his mother had tried to pull such a stunt in order to manipulate him. Calling her bluff, he handed her a knife. Deborah stopped. After a moment, she put the knife down. She tried to calm herself and insisted that the money was for rent, not drugs. In the end, she won. Out of guilt or exasperation, Matthew handed her all of his money. He never saw his mother again, and it would not be until 2013 that he learned of her fate. But other than his own admission of a crime on that day, what other evidence is there to tie Isreal Keyes to Deborah Feldman's disappearance? The rest appears to be, unfortunately, far more speculative in comparison. A search of Keyes' computer revealed that he had searched online for news regarding the missing woman, though he misspelled her name as, quote, Deborah. This is notable because Deborah's disappearance received nearly zero media coverage. During his interrogation years later, investigators showed Keyes several photos of missing people. He dismissed each one quickly, insisting that he knew nothing, until he was presented with a photo of Deborah. "I don't want to talk about her yet," he said. He never would. Sadly, Deborah's body has never been found, and her case remains officially unsolved, though Keyes still remains a suspect. Thank you for your interest in 12 Gauge Investigative. Tune in tomorrow for the next chapter as we go on the journey to learn more about Isreal Keyes, the nomadic devil. Like, subscribe, and share.
I'm a true crime channel.
12 Gauge Investigators is the best.